Like Vasquez said in Aliens, let's rock. If you're new to the tribe, Rad is across the table, Rich is behind the mix. My name is Yanni Bormeister, and we are Unity Gym, experts at turning driven people into athletes. This episode is brought to you by the Unify Movement System, the online program that balances strength, flexibility, and fitness in an efficient 60-minute workout so you can unleash your inner athlete. Get daily coaching by us, plus our epic gym and home UMS programs, extensive exercise library, private coaching group, and weekly coaching calls. As a valued listener, use the link in the description to get your first month free. Before we get started, as usual, warm welcome. If you are watching on the Unity Gym YouTube channel, remember to hit that like button. The more likes we get, the more legends get to see this content. And as always, please subscribe if you like what you see. I'm excited to announce that joining us today, we have Phil White from ADPT Physio.
Woo! And if you didn't know, Phil started work in the fitness industry back in 2012, first as a remedial massage therapist, and then went on to study exercise and sports science and a doctor of physiotherapy postgraduate degree. Now he runs ADPT Physio, where they specialize in delivering the athlete rehab experience to everyone. Phil is a massage therapist. Phil has been a massage therapist to the GWS Giants AFL team, to Olympians, Paralympians, and a number of other professional athletes. Always good to have you on the show, Phil. How are you, man?
Very well. I'm excited about this topic. I think it's one that people have pretty unhelpful ideas about. And so if we can change how everyone in the world thinks about this, and hopefully this one podcast will do that. I think
podcast will change the world.
Yeah, I think there'll be a lot fewer issues in over prescription of like opioids, over surgery, like over kind of done of surgeries, people not doing exercise because they're scared of it. I think this is going to be the one that changes the world. Let's do it.
Yeah, let's go. So this question comes from Helen Madge, and she's in our UMS online coaching group. Helen asked, can you actually wear out joints from too much exercise? And if so, is there any way to minimize that damage? And I think we'll throw this one straight to Rad. We'll talk about a couple of the research studies that we've sort of discovered or been told about.
Well, I won't even talk about a research study because I could not tell you where it's from. What I'll talk about is one of the experiences that we had with one of our friends and mentors, Dr. Tony Battaji, where in one of his workshops, I remember asking a similar question, or somebody asked a similar question. And this is going back 10 years now, so that's why I'm not going to quote any study or anything, but Tony reads the studies. And he was saying that, funnily enough, it's one of the very few downsides to high intensity resistance training. And when I'm talking high intensity, I'm talking very, very heavy weightlifting over long periods of time, is that in those individuals, you can see an increase in joint degradation, like early onset arthritis and things like that. Now, that's what I remember. Phil, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so it's something that
I didn't get to talk about my study.
Oh, do you want to go on?
Oh.
No, go, Yanni.
I was just kind of going to quickly look it up because I read an article. I used to be quite into bodybuilding, and I was a subscriber of T Nation, which is actually not a bad source of information. You've got people like Dr. Lane Norton posting on there. Anyway, there was an article on here that was written by Dr. Stuart McGill, who's an authority on spine. An authority on sort of spine health and has done a lot of research in that field and done a research on this field of wear and tear. And in that article, he was citing a study that he was involved in, I believe, where they looked at first responders in America, in New York City, over 2,000 first responders. So that's police and paramedics and fighters. And they wanted to sort of ascertain whether resistance training exercise reduced the chances of getting injured on the job. And what they found was that there was a very, very important key element, which was the intensity that they exercised at. So the cohort of people that exercised to what was perceived to be or recorded to be at a high intensity were actually more susceptible to injury and more susceptible to wear and tear. And the cohort that exercised at a low to moderate intensity weren't. and were less susceptible for injury. So there is this, and we're going to throw this to Phil in a sec, but my belief and understanding based on that article is that, yeah, exercise when done to a moderate intensity or periodized properly is very, very good, very beneficial. But if you just go and smash yourself every session, there is a fair bit of evidence to indicate that long term it's not really that good for the body. What do you think, Phil?
Yeah, so I'm going to start off with something that I guess might be a bit shocking to people, is that even if you did have significant joint changes, so significant arthritis, that doesn't mean you'll have any decrease in function, and it doesn't necessarily mean you'll have pain. So that might be a bit shocking to people, but I would really like you to go and listen to the pain science episodes that we've done, because that will give you a bit of an insight into it. But it's just a really key one to and I'm going to talk about how, we want to avoid those morphological changes, so morphology being changes in the structure if we can. But I just want to really highlight that the now current understanding is quite different from where people used to think, like, if you have X amount of damage, you're going to have X amount of pain and dysfunction, and you're going to need joint replacements, and you're going to need this and that. So just want to get that out of the way and be really clear about that early on, that is just not the case. And if you if you scanned like most people over the age of 40, they're going to have some level of, I'm always just doing my age plus 10 here, so for anything, just make myself still feel young. But basically, you're pretty much always going to see some changes in joint morphology, but you won't necessarily have any pain or dysfunction. And you can look at people who have very squeaky clean in very common looking joints, and they might have pain and dysfunction. So it's so much more complicated than what people sort of have in their head and what they used to think about, like damage equals pain and dysfunction. So that's just going to be my first point. Now the second point is I want you to think about human. I've talked about this on another show, but this idea that Nassim Taleb talked about with economies around being anti-fragile. And so people often sort of think with that, like, you're either going to be fragile is one end of the spectrum, and then robust is the other end of the spectrum. So either it will take a little bit of force and disruption and you'll crumble, you'll break, or you can be really robust, and that you just you can take a real a robust structure will take a lot of force, take a lot of load, and then it will eventually get worn away and crumble. But human bodies are different to that. They're what you call anti-fragile, which is that a positive amount of stress will actually make them stronger and stronger over time. So that's how training works. That's how progressive overload of strength and fitness works. Is you're basically, if you give it a positive amount of stress, then you're going to become more resilient to that strength, to that stress, and be able to handle it better over time. So that's, I think, the key thing to think here is, like, when you're choosing whether or not to do exercise, it's not a matter of will doing exercise now lead to me gradually degrading my robust body and being in this sort of state of disrepair in my older age. No, if you can dose exercise appropriately, then you can actually make yourself stronger, more resilient, and to be able to handle what you do. So that idea of dosage, I think, is just a really key thing here. And I've been using this more and more recently with patients, this idea that exercise is medicine. And just like with any medicine, you can take too much of it and have a bad result. But if you take the right amount of it, you're going to get that desired effect. So we need to be taking our medicine, but we need to be taking the right amount. And that's where we're going to find that sweet spot.
And there are other variables that come into play, and this is why I think it's really important that you get the guidance of someone who's a professional in the field, because, arguably, and it is debated that form and technique is very important for the concept of loading areas of the body or overloading areas of the body that may not respond as well to it.
Yeah, it's something that's really debated these days. With people used to be so strict about technique with absolutely everything, and we give a lot of guidance around the optimal way to do things, because we're always talking about treating your easy reps as if it was a rehearsal for your heaviest possible reps. But there's a lot of research into lower level stuff with bad technique. It's not going to be suddenly the make or break of whether you have morphologic change. So I just want to get that one out there, because if some people will listen to this and they'll be listening to a lot of Greg Lehman's work and Adam Meakins, who are some really prominent physios who are talking about this, and they're kind of on the evidence-based side of practice, who are pointing out that just because you're around your back doing a deadlift, or just because your knees come go into valgus when you're doing a squat, that doesn't necessarily mean you're going to have bad outcomes. And that's totally true. But yeah, as we like think about when we're trying to then go to like optimal performance with really pushing PBs and really copying what the people who lift the heaviest weights in the world do. We think that, you know, when you're doing low level stuff, it's a great time to practice for the big
stuff. That's exactly right. And then there's also the other variable, which is what we refer to as structural balance, anatomical structural balance, which is and we had a good conversation with Sebastian Orob from Australian Strength Coach, who's a professional powerlifter and powerlifting coach and just strength coach all round to many athletes, you know, and I've been a proponent of structural balance training all of my career. I first learnt the concepts from Tony Battaglia and the late Charles Poliquin, and in its absolute basic form, structural balance is kind of, you could sort of say, you know, if you train one side of the body, then train the other side evenly. It's opposing joint muscle. Every joint sort of has an agonist and an antagonist that they move in multi directions. And if you overtrain one side, it can affect the performance of that joint and the stability of that joint. And you can have, you know, it can expose the body to more joint glide, which can then lead to passive structures getting aggravated, and I don't want to use the term worn out, but you know,
the passive structures will take more load, and as we've talked about, like there's going to be an optimal load that will stimulate a reinforcement of that load, of that structure, and then there's going to be, if you go massively above that threshold, then you can start to cause overload that passive structure, and that can lead to issues.
And this is what the UMS program is built. This is our philosophy: is balance. And that balance we talk about on a very, very surface level, on a macro level, is balance between the three primary attributes of an athlete, which is strength, flexibility, and fitness. But then if you go a little bit deeper, the next layer is balance between limb symmetry. You know, we want to try to keep the body as well balanced as possible from left to right side. And then if we go another layer deeper, it's balance between the agonist and antagonist muscle groups in every joint. So we're talking now about that anatomical structural balance. And then if we want to go the next layer down, it's balance between the stability and the big phasic muscle system. So each joint has an inner unit, and the most obvious example of this is the shoulder joint has the rotator cuff muscles, which are there to stabilize and keep the joint in its optimal position, or I guess sort of localize the joint. How would you explain the role of the rotator cuff? Kind of like that.
Yeah, basically trying to keep the ball in the middle of the socket.
Yeah, that's the right.
Understanding.
And then on the outside, you've got the big phasic muscles: the pecs, the lats, the biceps, the deltoids. And these muscles are creating the movement that we see. The prime movers. And you want to have balance between those two. And there is a formula that strength coaches and sports scientists have studied for many, many years, that would suggest that if you can push this amount of load, you should be able to pull this amount of load and externally rotate this amount of load to keep that all in balance. And those formulas vary slightly depending on what research you look at, and whether the individual is training for a certain sport and you want to optimize certain things. So yeah, it's that is really the philosophy that the UMS is built on.
Even bigger than that, like zooming way out to then bigger picture balance is you're doing a balance of high intensity, of low intensity. You've got times where you're peaking, you've got times where you're deloading and recovering. And I think for this particular question, that's probably the most important thing, is looking at that really big sort of macro loading picture. Like, how are you periodizing your training over time, and how does that fit in with the other aspects of your life? So sleep, stress, nutrition, all those big recovery factors. Because as we said, like you've got to have stimulus, but then you've got to have recovery. You got to have a right amount of stimulus and right amount of recovery. And that's where, like, a lot of these sort of looking at people who have, you know, trained heavy weights for a long time, or these, you know, firefighters who have done heavy and high intensity stuff. Those firefighters are doing a pretty intense job. They're adding intensity into their, like, they've got stress and intensity in their job. They've got stress and intensity with their training. And that's like likely why they then had these sort of long-term like changes in their joint structures, because basically we need, if you can give your tissues that right amount of stimulus and then that right amount of recovery, and that might be like, you can go, if you're going higher intensity, then you need more recovery. It's like all about trying to find that balance of giving that your body a chance to adapt, because just remember that every structure in your body is constantly turning over tissues. So your skin's constantly turning over, regenerating more skin cells. Your muscles are constantly regenerating more muscle cells. Your cartilage is doing that, but all of them, and your bones and your ligaments and everything, but it's all doing it at slightly different rates. So often when you get into training, you'll be kind of you're trying to improve at the rate at which your muscles can adapt to things, which is quite a lot faster than the other structures. And especially when you're a beginner, because you're getting the neural adaptations, which are the fastest of all. Neural adaptations being able to activate more muscle units, not neural like nerves growing. They're actually really slow. But basically, like people sort of fall into that trap of being like, oh, my muscles are keeping up, or my fitness, which can improve quite quickly, is improving. So therefore I need to constantly be pushing myself further and further and further until you run into that kind of brick wall. But you just want to think, like, if your muscles are adapting over, like, you can have some significant changes in hypertrophy over 6 weeks, but for your cartilage, for your ligaments and for your bones, like that's probably going to happen more over the 8, 12, like 14, 16 week sort of time period, that if you're like accelerating off in this direction and then the other adaptations are happening slower and not keeping up, then that's where you start to run into issues where you're with those, as I said, with your constant turnover, what you're getting is like synthesis and atrophy of all these structures. So and basically if you're having more atrophy and less stimulus and less synthesis because you've put a lot of stress on the system, then and too much stress for it to be able to handle without adequate recovery, so without adequate nutrition and sleep, then that's where you start to get these long-term morphological changes. And that's really that's a hard thing to do, because human nature is you want to go hard, you want to get like quick results, and you know, athletes as well, like there's a lot of talk about like, oh, you know, I played footy and I played professional sports, but now I'm paying for it because I got no, you know, I can't use my knees anymore. And like that, they will have made decisions in their career that they have to be at the absolute peak as quickly as possible, and they won't have followed like the best longevity training. They've gone for the best short term meet their current goals, which is, you know.
We've had in here to come and train with us in the gym. We've had one of the most highly achieved rugby league players come and train with us, and also one of the highest Ironman come and train with us. And both of them said, God, I wish I came and trained with you guys when I was competing, because they both came to us after they were competing at the top. And it's really interesting, because a lot of people think that professional athletes, they just get it right and they're really good, but most people know that there's this idea that most professional athletes kind of have a peak, and then after about the age of 30 they really can't compete at the top anymore. And there's a very few examples. I don't remember the guy's name, but there was a NBA player who is 40 or 41, and this is very recent, I'm not talking about years ago, who is still playing in the NBA, and he's got this, like, the record of the most amount of time playing in the NBA, most amount of games, and he's a defender. And when they looked into what he does, he basically has this mentality that everything is just about this maintenance of what he's got, rather than this constant pushing for the best. And I wish I could remember the guy's name, but I'm not American, so
yeah, it's a really key one to understand, because and especially I think it's changing as well, because now, like, if you're looking at those guys, like, they're probably in their 40s, 50s, like
and they were at their peak 20 years ago,
and 20 or
maybe 10
and 20 years ago,
the
understanding around this and the application of sports science was nowhere near what it is now. And so it would be quite interesting to see, like, 20 years from now with up and coming athletes, if they've done a bit better. But they're always going to be making those decisions about peaking as quickly as possible and hard as possible to get, like, the results, because they'll have financial changes on it. But when you look at longevity, like, there is no reason why, like, you can't train hard throughout your whole life if you just make sure that you're then thinking about all the different factors of balance that Yanni talked about. But even bigger is getting that factor of balance of the programming throughout all the different stresses in your life and trying to keep that.
That's the point that I wanted to end on. You know, that we had a great discussion with Tony Battaji on this, and you need to take into consideration the other different stress mechanisms in your life: financial stress, relationship stress, career stress, sleep deprivation stress if you've got new kids, young children. You know, exercise is a stress on the body. Nutrition can be a stress on the body if you're either eating too much or you're eating too much junk, you know, too much processed food that's going to have an impact on your gut, on your body, on your immune system. So
it's that stimulus recovery thing, isn't it? It's the idea this go hard or go home, if you look deeper into that, it's that people are thinking, and they don't even know they're thinking this, but they think that it's just stimulus that gives result, and it never is. It's a stimulus first, and then it's the recovery that creates the adaptation.
And I just want to quickly look at this before we wrap up.
Yeah, stimulus positive adaptation.
Yeah, well, I just want to still, like, I think going to extremes is a really good thing of making things clear. I'd still rather be the person who's gone way too hard and exercised way too hard, like, and cause these changes in morphology than to be the person who never applied any stimulus, because like your body adapts to what you spend your time doing. And if you've been like, oh no, I don't want to get bad joints because I'm like in the future, so I'm going to stay away from exercise, and then you never give yourself any stimulus, then you basically, your body's like, oh sweet, we don't need to put all these expensive resources into cartilage, we don't need to put into bone mineral density, and then you're going to be so metabolically deranged and in a bad way that basically then as soon as you start to do basically activities of daily living, and once especially when you get older, when you lose muscle mass, when you like all of these things, then you're going to get like, you're going to have less like you're going to have structures that will basically be damaged from really low intensity stuff, and you'll end up with like knee arthritis and all of this stuff anyway,
and fear of doing anything,
and you won't have all the positive benefits that doing that high intensity exercise will have had on your cardiovascular health, your muscle density, your muscle strength. And yeah, you can, as I said, if you do have damage, it doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be in pain. If you have really strong muscles, then your passive structures are going to be much better off. And just quickly, people particularly think about this in terms of running, and I want to point out that the mechanism that you actually stimulate bone growth and cartilage density improvements is impact. And people get so scared of impact, and they think, oh no, I've got these injuries, I can't do impact, I should just swim, and I love swimming. But like, people just get so scared of impact, but really it's just a matter of dosage. And if you dose appropriately,
I've got a final thought on this one. And it is all about everything that Phil just talked about there. My way of giving it in the layman, quick, easy understanding way is it's periodization. If you understand periodization and how to use it, and if you don't, a really simple and easy way is what we apply in the UMS, which is choose 4-week training blocks, have a peak week followed by a deload week. And what that means is that every 4 weeks you change some stimulus variables, and you ramp up to a peak week in the 3rd week, where you gradually increase your intensity, increase your load, increase the demand on your body so that you really understand what you're capable of when you do your peak week. It's not just like, I'm going to try as hard as I can. And you do an intelligent peak week, but that is followed by a deload/recovery week. And if you follow that approach, what we've found is that works really well with people.
And just zoom out, like think about with your training, is it and it's totally okay to train hard for events, but like think about how does that fit into the bigger picture, and is longevity your game, or is it being the absolute peak of fitness as quickly as possible, and just make those decisions with good information.
Yep, perfect.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much for listening, everybody. If anybody wants to connect with Phil can be found on Instagram at ADPT Physio, and you can book in for an in-person session or an online session with Phil at adpt.physio.
And I just want to quickly point out that online physio, this is exactly what we do, is looking at that, like, how does your all your training fit together, and what can you do to make sure that you're getting basically the best long-term results. Because that's, I think people sort of have in their idea that physio is all poking and prodding and needles or whatever, but no, this is the big stuff that has the biggest long-term effect.
I can attest to that, because it wasn't online, it was face-to-face with you. But one of the greatest aspects of my rehabilitation of a slap tear was just the conversation that I used to have with you, which could have very easily been done online, where you were just explaining to me, you probably should include this in your training for a couple of weeks and then change to this. And it was having that conversation with you that allowed me to recover pretty much 100% from a slap tear without surgery at all. So there you go.
Love it.
Thanks for tuning in, everyone. And
cheers,
thanks,
guys.
Phil, as always. And we'll see you for the next episode of the Sound of Movement podcast.
Hope this one changed the world.